"Grandpa, please, you have to come." She locked me in. She beat me, and now the police are here, and Dad will not even look at me. That was the desperate, whispering voice of my 15-year-old granddaughter at 2:14 in the morning. When I kicked open the heavy doors of the 12th District Police Station, the rookie cop tried to shove me back. He told the old man to sit down and wait his turn. He had no idea he had just put his hands on a retired state Supreme Court judge, and he had no idea the absolute hell I was about to unleash on the woman who dared to lay a hand on my blood. My name is Richard Harrison. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 years of my life sitting on the bench making decisions that altered the course of thousands of lives. I built a reputation for being tough, observant, and fiercely protective of the truth. But sitting in my empty house in suburban Chicago, I was just a grandfather who missed his family. Since my wife Patricia passed away 5 years ago from pancreatic cancer, the silence in my large house had become deafening. My son Bradley, who is 42 and a highly successful structural engineer, used to bring my granddaughter Lily over every Sunday. We would barbecue, watch baseball, and keep Patricia's memory alive. But all of that changed 2 years ago when Bradley married Victoria. Victoria was 35, immaculate, charming, and exactly the kind of woman who subtly but systematically isolates a man from his roots. The Sunday dinners turned into monthly brief visits, then holidays only, then just a few text messages. I was slowly being pushed out of my own granddaughter's life, but I never wanted to be the bitter father-in-law who meddled in his son's marriage, so I kept my distance and gave them space. That was the biggest mistake of my life. When the phone rang at 2:14 in the morning, the sound tore through the quiet dark of my bedroom like a siren. I answered immediately. Lily was hyperventilating on the other end, her voice barely a squeak. She said she was at the police station. She said Victoria had locked her in her room, hit her, and then called the police, claiming Lily had attacked her. And the part that shattered my heart was when she sobbed that her father was just standing there, agreeing with Victoria. I threw on my coat over my clothes, grabbed my keys, and ran out into the freezing Chicago rain. I drove my SUV recklessly through the empty streets, my mind racing. Lily was a gentle, quiet girl. She had struggled with anxiety since her grandmother died, but she was never violent. Never. The idea that she would attack anyone was completely absurd. I arrived at the 12th District Precinct and left my car running right in the loading zone. I stormed through the double doors, rain dripping from my coat. A young rookie officer, probably no older than 25, stepped right into my path. He puffed out his chest, held up his hand, and told me I could not just barge in here. He told the wet old man to step back and wait at the front desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply looked him dead in the eye with the exact same stare I used to silence high-profile defense attorneys in my courtroom. I stepped closer, closing the distance, and told him that my granddaughter was in one of those holding rooms and I was going in there right now. He reached for my shoulder to physically push me back. Before his fingers could even touch my coat, the older desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork. The color instantly drained from the sergeant's face. He scrambled out from behind the desk, nearly tripping over his own chair. He grabbed the rookie by the collar and yanked him back so hard the kid stumbled. The sergeant looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine panic, and said, "Your Honor, Judge Harrison." "I am so sorry, sir. I did not know the girl was calling you." I did not even acknowledge the apology. I asked him where they were keeping her. He pointed with a trembling hand down the hall to interrogation room number 3. I walked past them, my heavy boots echoing on the linoleum floor. I kicked the door of room 3 open without knocking. The scene inside made my blood boil. In the far corner of the room, Lily was huddled on a hard plastic chair. Her hair was tangled, her eyes were swollen and red from crying, and she was shaking uncontrollably. But what made me sick to my stomach was the other side of the room. Victoria was sitting there putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. She was sobbing loudly, her face buried in my son Bradley's chest. I looked at my son. Bradley, the strong, capable engineer who used to carry Lily on his shoulders, was just standing there staring blankly at the wall while he mechanically patted Victoria's back. I slammed the door shut behind me. "What the hell is going on in here?" I demanded, my voice filling the small room. Lily looked up and a fresh wave of tears streamed down her face. "Grandpa," she whispered, reaching out toward me. I walked straight to her and put my body between her and them. Victoria pulled her face away from Bradley's chest. She looked at me, her eyes perfectly filled with fake tears, and sniffled. "Richard, thank God you are here. It has been a nightmare. Lily has completely lost her mind." She held up her left forearm to show me. There were 3 deep, bloody scratches running down her pale skin. Victoria started crying again, her voice trembling. "I found illicit pills in her room, Richard. When I tried to confront her and take them away, she went completely manic. She locked the door, trapped me inside, and attacked me like a wild animal. We had no choice but to call the police to restrain her. It was for her own safety." I turned to look at my son. "Bradley," I said firmly, "is this true? Did your daughter attack your wife?" Bradley blinked slowly. He looked at me, but his eyes were completely glazed over. His pupils were sluggish, his posture slightly slumped. He did not look like a concerned father dealing with a family crisis. He looked like a man who had been heavily sedated. He nodded slowly, his voice flat and robotic. "Yes, Dad. Lily is out of control. She has severe psychological issues. We cannot handle her at home anymore." Victoria wiped her eyes with a tissue and added quickly, "I have already contacted a specialized behavioral modification facility in rural Nevada. They have a bed ready for her. Bradley signed the emergency medical guardianship papers tonight. The transport van is picking her up at our house at dawn. It is the only way to save her, Richard." I stood there in the cold fluorescent light of the police station, taking it all in. My son practically a zombie signing away his daughter. My daughter-in-law playing the bleeding victim, and my granddaughter terrified and labeled a violent drug addict. If you are listening to this right now, pay close attention. Evil rarely announces its arrival with a warning. It often creeps in wearing a warm smile and a perfectly plausible lie. And right now, Victoria was selling a very plausible lie to the police. But she forgot one critical detail. She forgot who she was dealing with. I did not spend 4 decades analyzing criminal behavior and forensic evidence just to be fooled by a few fake tears. I took a deep breath, forcing my anger down, and engaged the cold, analytical side of my brain. I looked at the evidence right in front of me. First, I looked down at Lily's hands as she clung to my coat. Ever since Patricia died, Lily suffered from severe anxiety. Her coping mechanism was biting her nails. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, the skin around them red and raw. She physically did not have the fingernails required to make deep, clean scratch marks on anyone. Then I looked at Victoria's forearm. 3 parallel scratches, but I noticed the angle. The cuts were deepest at the top, right near the elbow, and faded into lighter, shallower marks as they moved down toward the wrist. That is not the forensic angle of a defensive wound inflicted by an attacker standing in front of you. That is the exact pressure pattern of a self-inflicted wound. She had scratched herself. My gut screamed that something incredibly dark was happening in my son's house. But I also knew the law. Bradley was Lily's legal guardian. If I caused a scene right now, if I accused Victoria of lying and self-harm without hard proof, Bradley would simply invoke his parental rights. Take Lily away, and I would be barred from seeing her entirely. The transport van was coming at dawn. I had to play this smart. I had to play along. I let out a heavy sigh, letting my shoulders slump slightly, as if I was a tired old man accepting a tragic reality. "This is a lot to process," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "If she is using drugs and becoming violent, then maybe professional help is what she needs." I saw a brief, triumphant gleam flash in Victoria's eyes before she hid it behind another fake sob. "Exactly, Richard. We are just trying to save her." Let me say goodbye to her, I said softly. Just give us a minute. Victoria nodded and gently pulled Bradley toward the door. Bradley followed her like a well-trained dog, his feet dragging slightly on the floor. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, I turned to Lily. I pulled her into a tight hug, shielding her from the small window in the door. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out a small emergency burner phone I always kept for travel. I slipped it silently into her jacket pocket. I leaned in close, my lips right next to her ear, and whispered, "Listen to me very carefully, sweetheart. I know she is lying. I know you did not do this. When you get back to that house tonight, go straight to your room and lock the door. Do not eat or drink anything that woman gives you. I am coming for you. Do you understand?" Lily nodded against my shoulder, a tiny breath of relief escaping her lips. I pulled away, kissed her forehead, and gave her a reassuring nod. Then I turned and walked out of the interrogation room. I kept my face entirely neutral as I walked past Victoria and Bradley in the hallway. I told them I would come by the house at 6 in the morning to see her off before the transport arrived. Victoria smiled her sickeningly sweet smile and thanked me for being so understanding. The moment I walked out of the police station and the cold rain hit my face, the facade dropped. My hands were shaking not from the cold, but from a rage so profound it scared me. My son was being drugged. My granddaughter was being framed and shipped away to a facility in the middle of nowhere. I got into my SUV, slammed the door, and immediately pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I had not called in years. Jonathan Mitchell. He was a ruthless former federal prosecutor who had left the government to start his own private investigation firm. He answered on the second ring. "Jonathan," I said, my voice hard as steel. "I need a full deep dive background check on my daughter-in-law, Victoria Harrison. And I need a complete corporate rundown on a behavioral modification facility in rural Nevada. And Jonathan, I need it before the sun comes up." "Consider it done, Judge," he replied without hesitation. I put the car in drive and accelerated into the dark streets. Victoria thought she could orchestrate a quiet little tragedy in my family. She thought I was just a clueless old man who would step aside and watch his blood be destroyed. She was about to find out exactly why they used to call me the most unforgiving judge in the state of Illinois. The jarring ring of the telephone at 2:14 in the morning is a sound that never brings good news. I sat up in the darkness of my bedroom, my heart immediately pounding against my ribs. I reached for the receiver on the nightstand, expecting the worst, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer terror in the voice on the other end of the line. "Grandpa, please, you have to come right now. She locked me in. She beat me, and now the police are here and Dad will not even look at me." It was Lily, my 15-year-old granddaughter, and she was sobbing so uncontrollably she could barely breathe. I asked her where she was, and she whispered that they were at the 12th District Police Station. The line went dead before I could say another word. "My name is Richard Harrison. I am 70 years old. For 40 years of my life, I sat on the bench as a state Supreme Court judge making decisions that altered the course of thousands of lives. I built a reputation for being tough, deeply observant, and fiercely protective of the truth. But standing in my empty house in suburban Chicago, shoving my arms into a heavy winter coat, I was just a desperate grandfather who missed his family. Since my wife Patricia passed away 5 years ago from pancreatic cancer, the silence in my large colonial home had become absolutely deafening. My son Bradley, who is 42 and a highly successful structural engineer, used to bring Lily over every single Sunday. We would barbecue in the backyard, watch baseball games on the old television, and keep Patricia's warm memory alive. But all of that changed 2 years ago when Bradley married Victoria. Victoria was 35, immaculate, charming, and exactly the kind of woman who subtly but systematically isolates a man from his roots. The Sunday dinners turned into monthly brief visits, then holidays only, then just a few scattered text messages. I was slowly being pushed out of my own granddaughter's life. But I never wanted to be the bitter father-in-law who meddled in his son's marriage, so I kept my distance and gave them their space. As I grabbed my car keys and ran out into the freezing Chicago rain, I realized that giving them space was the biggest mistake of my life. I threw my SUV into gear and drove recklessly through the empty, slick streets. Every red traffic light I ran was a testament to the boiling fury in my chest. I had spent my entire career maintaining order, upholding the law, and punishing those who abused their power. But in that moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, I was willing to tear down every single rule I had ever sworn to protect if it meant keeping my granddaughter safe. I thought about the last time I had seen Lily. It was nearly 3 months ago. She had looked so incredibly thin, her posture hunched, her bright spirit dimmed by the suffocating atmosphere Victoria had created in that house. I remembered how Victoria hovered over every conversation we had, dictating the schedule, constantly checking her watch, making sure Bradley was always aligned with her subtle, controlling demands. I had been a fool to think that maintaining family peace was more important than protecting my own blood. I should have recognized the malicious intent hiding behind Victoria's perfectly tailored designer clothes and her practiced, condescending smiles. The wipers slapped frantically against the windshield, but they could not clear the images flashing through my mind. Lily was a gentle, quiet girl. She had struggled with anxiety since her grandmother died, but she was never violent. The idea that she would attack anyone was completely absurd. Victoria had locked her in, beaten her, and somehow flipped the entire narrative to the police. And the part that shattered my heart the most was Lily sobbing that her own father was just standing there agreeing with his wife. I pulled up to the 12th District Precinct, throwing the vehicle into park right in the middle of the loading zone. I did not care about the flashing lights or the parking regulations. I marched toward the building entrance, cold rain dripping heavily from my coat onto the concrete pavement. The moment I pushed through the heavy glass double doors, the stale smell of damp uniforms, cheap black coffee, and lingering despair hit my nose. The precinct lobby was poorly lit, the fluorescent tubes buzzing with a low, irritating hum that mirrored the pounding headache forming behind my eyes. Several wooden benches were bolted to the scuffed floor, occupied by a few exhausted-looking individuals waiting for their turn to speak with an officer. I completely ignored them. My focus was entirely locked on the long hallway leading to the holding cells and interrogation rooms. My heavy winter boots squeaked loudly against the wet linoleum, leaving a trail of muddy water behind me. I did not bother unbuttoning my coat. I did not bother wiping the cold rain from my face. I was a man on a singular mission, driven by a primal need to shield the only piece of my late wife that I still had left in this world. A young rookie officer, probably no older than 25, stepped right into my path. He puffed out his chest, held up a hand, and told me I could not just barge in here. He told the wet old man to step back and wait his turn at the front desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply stopped, squared my shoulders, and looked him dead in the eye with the exact same stare I used to silence high-profile defense attorneys in my courtroom. I stepped closer, closing the distance, and told him that my granddaughter was in one of those holding rooms, and I was going in there right now. He reached for my shoulder, fully intending to physically push me back. Before his fingers could even touch the wet fabric of my coat, the older desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork. The color instantly drained from the sergeant's tired face. He scrambled out from behind the raised desk, nearly tripping over his own rolling chair. He grabbed the rookie by the collar and yanked him back so hard the kid stumbled into the wall. The sergeant looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine panic, and said, "Your Honor." "Judge Harrison." "I am so incredibly sorry, sir. I had absolutely no idea the girl was calling you." I did not waste a single breath acknowledging his panicked apology. I simply stared at him, my expression completely unreadable, until he quickly fumbled with the electronic lock controls. A loud buzz echoed through the lobby. The heavy security doors to the back holding area clicked and swung wide open, immediately granting me full, unrestricted access to the row of dark interrogation rooms where my terrified, vulnerable granddaughter was currently being held hostage by a massive, carefully coordinated, deeply malicious web of cruel, unforgivable family lies. Victoria pulled her face away from Bradley and looked at me. The tears on her cheeks looked incredibly real, but the way her eyes darted to assess my reaction gave her away entirely. She stepped forward, letting out a sharp, dramatic gasp as she deliberately extended her left arm toward the harsh overhead light of the interrogation room. "Look at what she did to me, Richard," she cried, her voice quivering with expertly practiced trauma. 3 thick, bloody scratches ran down her pale forearm. The skin was broken and angry red, the blood still fresh enough to smear slightly against the sleeve of her expensive cashmere sweater. I stared at the wounds, my facial muscles completely locked in place. I did not gasp or offer her comfort. I simply waited for her to weave the rest of her fabricated tragedy. She sniffled loudly, wiping her eyes with the back of her uninjured hand. "I was just doing the laundry," she began, her voice dropping into a fragile whisper. "I went into the bedroom to gather clothes, and I found a small plastic bag hidden inside one of her pillowcases. It was filled with illicit pills, Richard. Hard drugs. I was completely terrified for her safety. I confronted her about it because I love her like my own daughter, and I wanted to get her help right away. But the moment I showed her the bag, she completely snapped. She went manic." Victoria continued her performance, pacing slightly in the small room to add a physical element to her distress. She claimed that my granddaughter lunged at her, screaming profanities that did not even sound like the sweet girl I knew. She said Lily clawed at her arm, violently attacking her. She described how my granddaughter tried to fiercely snatch the bag of pills back, and then shoved her backward into the hallway before slamming the bedroom door and locking herself inside the dark room. "We had no choice but to call the police, Richard," she sobbed, clutching Bradley's arm again. "We were afraid she might hurt herself or try to swallow all those pills at once. We had to do it for her own protection. She was totally out of control, like a wild animal cornered in a cage." I slowly turned my gaze away from Victoria, staring forward coldly now. I looked directly at my son, who stood there silently. "Bradley," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "Is this true? Did your daughter violently attack your wife over a bag of narcotics tonight?" Bradley blinked slowly, as if the harsh fluorescent light was too heavy for his eyelids to bear right now. He looked at me, but his eyes were completely empty and devoid of life. There was no fatherly concern, no panic, no heartbreak visible. He looked like a hollow shell of the vibrant, sharp engineer he used to be. His posture was slumped and terribly weak overall. His shoulders sagged under the weight of an invisible burden. "Yes, Dad," he replied, his words slurring slightly together. "Lily has completely lost her mind. She is not the same girl anymore. We cannot manage her severe psychological issues at home. She is a danger to us and to herself." The flat, robotic tone of his voice sent a sudden chill straight down my spine. A loving father does not speak about his terrified 15-year-old daughter as if he were reading a generic legal disclaimer off a page. Victoria immediately stepped back in front of my quiet son. She sensed my intense scrutiny of her husband and moved to block my view. She placed a protective hand on Bradley's chest, positioning herself firmly between us. "It is breaking his heart, Richard," she whispered, playing the role of the devoted, suffering wife perfectly. "It is breaking both of our hearts. But we have to be strong parents right now. We cannot let her destroy her own life. That is why we have made a very difficult decision tonight." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope, holding it up like a strong physical shield. "I have spent the last few weeks consulting with top adolescent behavioral specialists," she explained smoothly without breaking eye contact. "I found a highly specialized behavioral modification facility located in rural Nevada. They handle extreme cases like this, teenagers suffering from severe drug-induced psychosis and violent manic episodes." I narrowed my eyes, staring at the heavy envelope in her manicured hands. "Nevada," I repeated coldly, letting the word hang in the quiet room. "You are sending my granddaughter halfway across the entire country away from her family. Victoria nodded solemnly, dabbing at her dry eyes once more again today. It is the only place equipped to handle her level of aggression and addiction, she insisted firmly. The doctors there are absolute miracle workers. Bradley signed the emergency medical guardianship papers just an hour ago in this very building. The ink is barely dry on the page. The facility has an extraction team already stationed in the city, waiting for our direct call. The transport van is scheduled to arrive at our house right at dawn. They are going to take her straight to the airport. It is the only way to save her life and her future, Richard completely. Lily let out a quiet, desperate whimper from the corner of the room. She curled her knees up to her chest, burying her face in her arms as Victoria outlined the terrifying plan. The pure malice radiating from my daughter-in-law was suffocating, but it was carefully wrapped in the guise of maternal concern. She had orchestrated this entire nightmare flawlessly. She created a narrative where Lily was the villain, and she was the brave stepmother, making the hardest choice to save the family. I looked at Bradley, hoping to see some spark of resistance fighting inside him tonight, but there was absolutely nothing. He just stared blankly at the floor, completely surrendered to her will. Victoria had legally outmaneuvered me, utilizing Bradley's status as the sole custodial parent to sign those emergency guardianship forms. If she truly had an extraction team waiting, then the clock was ticking down fast. I had only a handful of hours before strangers would arrive to legally kidnap my granddaughter under the protection of state law. My mind raced through the countless judicial proceedings I had presided over, analyzing every possible loophole in this sudden emergency transfer. Victoria watched my face, closely waiting. She was waiting for me to explode, to yell, to give her a reason to ban me from the house entirely. She wanted a confrontation right here in the police station, where she could paint me as an unhinged enabler supporting a violent drug addict. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I locked my emotions down deep inside my chest, completely freezing my heart. I knew that the only way to save Lily was to systematically dismantle this lie piece by piece from the inside out. I had to let Victoria believe that she had actually won tonight, completely forever now. I slowly nodded at her silent. I forced my shoulders to drop, mastering the illusion of a defeated grandfather. "You are right, Victoria," I murmured. "If things have escalated to this dangerous point, we have to rely on the professionals. We cannot let her spiral any further out of control." Victoria let out a theatrical breath of relief. She reached out and squeezed my forearm. "Thank you for understanding, Richard," she said softly. "We just want her to get better." I turned my attention back to the corner of the small room. Lily was still curled up on the hard plastic chair. She looked entirely broken by the adults supposed to protect her. She watched me with wide, terrified eyes, clearly believing I had just given up on her, too. I took slow steps across the linoleum floor until I stood right in front of her. I crouched down and looked directly into her swollen eyes. "Come here, sweetheart," I whispered gently. "Let Grandpa give you a hug before I go." Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second before throwing her arms around my neck. She buried her face into the collar of my wet coat, her body trembling against mine. I wrapped my arms around her, using my broad frame to block Victoria and Bradley from seeing my hands. As I held her tight with my left arm, my right hand slipped smoothly into the hidden inner pocket of my coat. My fingers wrapped around the small burner phone I always kept charged. I slid the device deep into the side pocket of Lily's denim jacket, making sure it was completely concealed. I leaned my head down, pressing my cheek against her messy hair. I dropped my voice to the quietest register possible. "Listen to me very carefully, Lily," I whispered into her ear. "I know she is lying. I know you did not attack her today. Do not react. Just keep crying." She tightened her grip on my coat, clutching the wet fabric desperately. "There is a small phone in your jacket right now." I continued, speaking rapidly, but very clearly. "Keep it completely hidden from them. When they take you back to the house tonight, go straight to your bedroom and lock the heavy door. Do not eat a single thing Victoria offers you. Do not drink the water or the juice she gives you. Not even a single sip. Do you understand me?" Lily gave a barely perceptible nod against my shoulder. I squeezed her tightly. I am going to figure out exactly what is happening in that house, I promised her silently. You are not going to Nevada. I am coming for you before the sun comes up. Just hold on a little longer. I pulled away slowly. I gave her a sad, weary smile, playing my part perfectly for the audience behind me. Be a good girl, Lily, I said loudly enough for Victoria to hear. Listen to the doctors. We just want you to be healthy and safe again. Lily looked at me, her eyes swimming with fresh tears, but this time I saw a tiny, resilient spark of understanding hidden deep within them. She knew I had a plan. Okay, Grandpa, she whispered. I will try. I pushed myself up from the floor. Bradley was still staring blankly at the cold wall, checked out of reality. I will see you both at the house at 6 in the morning, I said wearily. I want to be there when the transport van arrives. Of course, Richard, Victoria replied smoothly. We will see you bright and early. I walked out of the interrogation room without looking back. I moved slowly down the long corridor, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped. The older sergeant gave me a sympathetic look. I ignored him and pushed through the heavy double doors into the freezing Chicago night. The moment the cold rain hit my face, the exhausted grandfather routine vanished entirely. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back as the pure, unadulterated fury I had been suppressing finally roared to the surface. My blood was boiling. The sight of those fake, calculated scratches on Victoria's arm made me absolutely sick to my stomach. She was orchestrating a massive, sinister operation right under my nose. I marched across the wet pavement toward my idling vehicle. I climbed inside and slammed the door shut. I reached into the center console, pulled out my smartphone, and aggressively dialed the only man in Chicago who could help me navigate the dark mess I was about to uncover. Jonathan Mitchell was a ruthless, brilliant former federal prosecutor who had left the government to build a highly secretive private firm. He owed me a massive favor from my days on the bench, and I was calling it in tonight. He answered on the second ring. Judge Harrison, he said smoothly. This is an unexpected time to be hearing your voice. What can I do for you tonight? Jonathan, I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. I am facing a highly volatile family emergency. I need you to mobilize your entire team right this second. I need a comprehensive deep dive background check on a woman named Victoria Harrison. She is my daughter-in-law. I want everything you can find on her. Financial records. Previous marriages, hidden debts, burner accounts, medical prescriptions, and any known associates. Consider it done, Jonathan replied immediately. What else do you need? She is claiming to send my granddaughter to a specialized behavioral modification facility located somewhere in rural Nevada. I continued gripping the steering wheel tightly. I need you to cross-reference every single transport service and youth facility in that state that handles emergency extractions. Find out who runs them, who funds them, and if there are any shell corporations attached to those medical boards. I strongly suspect it is a complete fraud. I will put 3 of my best analysts on it right now, Jonathan assured me. Give me a few hours. When do you need the preliminary report? The transport van is arriving at my son's house at dawn, I told him coldly. I need undeniable proof of her lies before the sun comes up. I am going to tear her carefully constructed world entirely apart. Send the digital files directly to my encrypted server the absolute second you find the connection. Understood, Judge Jonathan said firmly. I will call you the exact moment I have the smoking gun. I disconnected the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I gripped the steering wheel, my jaw clenched tightly. Victoria actually thought she had successfully outsmarted the old man by using my son's parental authority against me. But she was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating a man who had spent his entire life hunting down liars, manipulating evidence, and delivering justice to those who wrongly believed they were untouchable. I pulled my vehicle out of the parking lot and drove out into the dark night. I slowly nodded at her silent. The silence stretched in that cramped interrogation room, heavy and suffocating. Inside my chest, a violent storm of absolute rage threatened to tear through my carefully maintained composure. I wanted to grab my son by the shoulders and shake him until whatever chemical fog clouding his mind finally dissipated. I wanted to point a finger directly at Victoria and expose her sinister performance to the entire precinct. But I did not survive 40 years in the judicial system by acting on blind impulse. I had presided over hundreds of criminal trials, watching seasoned liars weave elaborate webs of deceit right in front of my bench. I knew exactly how to recognize a fabricated narrative, and more importantly, I knew how to dismantle one without alerting the architect. I forced my breathing to slow down, inhaling the stale air of the police station, and engaged the cold, analytical side of my brain. I stepped back from the emotional horror of seeing my family destroyed, and became the judge once more. I needed to examine the physical evidence presented to me with complete clinical detachment. My eyes shifted back to the corner of the room, where my 15-year-old granddaughter sat shivering on the hard plastic chair. Lily had pulled her knees up tightly against her chest, wrapping her arms around her slender legs, in a desperate attempt to make herself as small as possible. I focused my attention entirely on her hands. Ever since my wife Patricia passed away 5 years ago, Lily had developed severe crippling anxiety. Her primary coping mechanism, which we had tried to help her overcome through countless therapy sessions, was nervous nail-biting. I looked closely at her trembling fingers gripping her denim jacket. Her fingernails were bitten completely down to the quick. The skin surrounding the nail beds was red raw and slightly irritated from years of constant anxious chewing. She did not have a single millimeter of sharp nail left on either hand. From a purely forensic standpoint, it was a biological impossibility for that terrified, fragile girl to inflict the kind of deep, jagged lacerations I had just seen on my daughter-in-law. Lily physically lacked the weapons required to execute the violent assault Victoria had so dramatically described. Having established the first physical inconsistency, I slowly turned my gaze back to Victoria. She was still holding her left arm slightly elevated, treating her injury like a sacred exhibit in a museum of victimhood. She wanted me to look at it. She needed me to be horrified by it. So I obliged her. I stared at the 3 bloody streaks running down her pale forearm. But I did not look with the horrified eyes of a grieving grandfather. I looked with the trained, calculating eyes of a man who had reviewed thousands of autopsy reports and assault photographs. I analyzed the specific trajectory and depth of the wounds. The 3 parallel scratches began high up on her forearm, just below the elbow joint. At the point of origin, the cuts were incredibly deep, breaking the skin violently enough to draw a significant amount of fresh blood. But as the scratches traveled downward toward her wrist, the lacerations became noticeably shallower, lighter, and eventually faded into mere pink abrasions on the surface of her skin. Any rookie medical examiner or first-year law student could tell you exactly what that specific injury pattern meant. If an attacker is standing in front of you and violently lunges forward to claw at your arm, the deepest point of impact and highest kinetic energy occurs at the end of their strike, usually resulting in a deeper gouge near the wrist as they pull their hand away. But Victoria's wounds told the exact opposite story. The heavy pressure at the top near the elbow, followed by the gradual fading of the scratches as they moved down the arm, is the textbook forensic signature of a self-inflicted wound. It happens when a person reaches across their own body with their opposite hand, digs their own fingernails into their flesh, and drags them downward, losing leverage and pressure as their hand moves further away from their center of gravity. Victoria had not been attacked by a manic drug-addicted teenager in a dark bedroom. She had stood in that hallway, deliberately dragged her own sharp, manicured acrylic nails down her own arm, and then called the police to frame an innocent child. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The sheer, calculated malice required to mutilate your own body just to destroy a child was staggering. I looked at the dark, triumphant glimmer hiding just beneath the surface of Victoria's tear-filled eyes. She was waiting for me to challenge her. She wanted me to call her a liar right here in front of the desk sergeant and the arresting officers. She had set a brilliant legal trap. If I lost my temper and accused her of faking the assault, I would immediately be painted as a delusional, grieving old man, refusing to accept the harsh reality of his granddaughter's dangerous drug addiction. And worse, Bradley was the sole legal guardian. He was standing right there, completely compliant, heavily sedated, and legally empowered to make all medical decisions for Lily. If I provoked a confrontation, Bradley would simply invoke his parental rights. He would walk out of this police station with Lily in his custody, ban me from their property permanently, and the transport van would take her to that mysterious facility in rural Nevada before I could even file a single motion in family court. I suppressed every natural instinct, screaming to aggressively protect my blood. I had to let this vile woman believe she had successfully manipulated the great Judge Harrison. I let out a long, shuddering breath, deliberately relaxing the rigid tension in my jaw. I allowed my shoulders to sag even further, transforming my posture into that of a broken, defeated elder who had finally accepted a painful truth. I looked at Bradley, who was still staring at the floor with those empty, lifeless eyes, and then I turned my focus entirely back to Victoria. "You are right, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice soft, raspy, and filled with a manufactured sorrow that tasted like poison on my tongue. I cannot deny what is right in front of my eyes anymore. I slowly reached up and pinched the bridge of my nose, mimicking the body language of overwhelming fatigue. I have been blind to how bad things have gotten at home. I continued, ensuring my tone conveyed absolute surrender. I just wanted to believe she was still the sweet little girl she used to be before Patricia passed away. But seeing your arm tonight, seeing the terrible state she is in right now, I know I cannot protect her from herself anymore. If she is hiding narcotics in your house and attacking you violently in the hallways, then we have crossed a dangerous line that I cannot fix with Sunday dinners and grandfatherly advice. Professional help might be the only logical option left. Victoria let out a theatrical sigh of relief as those words left my mouth. She truly believed she had manipulated the old judge into complete submission. I played my part perfectly, asking for one final moment to say goodbye to my granddaughter. I crouched down, wrapping my arms around Lily, and while my broad shoulders blocked their view, I smoothly slipped my emergency burner phone deep into the pocket of her denim jacket. I pressed my cheek against hers and whispered a strict command to lock her bedroom door and refuse any food or drink from her stepmother. I promised her I was coming for her. Leaving the police station with my blood boiling, I immediately called Jonathan Mitchell, my most trusted private investigator. I ordered a comprehensive background check on Victoria and the Nevada facility before sunrise. By 6 a.m, I was standing inside the grand foyer of Bradley's estate, under the pretense of bringing breakfast before Lily departed. What I saw inside chilled me to the bone. Bradley was attempting to sign a stack of documents, but his hands shook violently, and his eyes could barely stay open. Victoria quickly handed him a cup of dark herbal tea, claiming it was for his nerves. He drank it obediently and instantly became even more sluggish and compliant. The horrific truth clicked in my mind. Lily was not the only victim in this house. My son was being heavily drugged into submission. Before I could process the sheer magnitude of Victoria's pharmaceutical control over my son, a heavy vehicle rumbled down the quiet suburban street. The crunch of thick tires on the wet gravel driveway drew my immediate attention toward the large front window. A massive, completely unmarked transport van pulled to a halt right in front of the house. Its windows were tinted so black that it looked like a hearse rather than a medical transport vehicle. There were no hospital logos, no state health department seals, and absolutely no indications of legitimate pediatric care. The heavy side doors slid open with a metallic clank, and two massive men stepped out into the freezing morning air. They did not wear medical scrubs or professional uniforms. They wore tight black tactical shirts, dark cargo pants, and heavy combat boots. They possessed the thick, muscular builds of nightclub bouncers or debt collectors, their expressions hard and entirely devoid of any medical empathy. One of them carried a thick canvas bag that looked terrifyingly like a restraint kit. Victoria practically beamed with wicked excitement as she saw them approach the front porch. She grabbed Bradley by his shoulder, steering his lethargic body toward the front door, to greet the men who were essentially here to kidnap his daughter. I stood frozen in the foyer, my mind racing through the terrifying legal implications of what was about to happen. Jonathan Mitchell had just texted me a brief cryptic update stating he was breaking into a restricted database to trace the Nevada facility's Shell Corporation records, but he desperately needed at least 2 more hours to secure the undeniable proof. If those 2 thugs dragged Lily out of her bedroom and forced her into that windowless van right now, she would be legally transported across state lines under Bradley's signature. Retrieving her from a hidden compound in the Nevada desert would take months of brutal litigation, and I knew deep down that Victoria would never let her survive that long. I needed to halt this extraction immediately. I could not use physical force against 2 massive mercenaries, and I could not appeal to my son's drugged mind. I needed an absolute, undeniable emergency that would completely override a scheduled medical transport. I looked at the large picture windows framing the front door. Several of Bradley's wealthy image-obsessed neighbors were already stepping out onto their porches to retrieve their morning newspapers, their curious eyes darting toward the ominous black van parked in the affluent neighborhood. Victoria cared about her pristine social facade above absolutely everything else. I knew exactly how to trap her. I stepped out onto the front porch just as the 2 burly men reached the top step. Victoria was handing them a clipboard, her voice dripping with fake sorrow as she explained how aggressive her stepdaughter had been. I took a deep breath of the freezing morning air and engaged every ounce of theatrical command I possessed. Suddenly, I stopped walking. I let my briefcase drop from my hand, allowing it to hit the wooden porch with a loud, startling smack. I raised my right hand and clutched the center of my chest, letting out a sharp, agonizing gasp that echoed clearly across the quiet street. Victoria spun around, her eyes narrowing with immediate suspicion, but I did not look at her. I focused on dropping my knees, making my collapse look as heavy and uncontrolled as possible. I crashed down onto the cold, wet gravel of the driveway, scraping my palms deliberately to add brutal realism to my fall. I curled my body into a tight, agonizing ball, grasping at the fabric of my coat over my heart, while forcing my breathing to become shallow and ragged. Richard, Victoria hissed sharply, taking a step toward me. "Get up! You are making a ridiculous scene." But I groaned loudly, squeezing my eyes shut and letting my face contort in absolute agony. My loud groan had exactly the intended effect. Across the street, Mrs. Gable dropped her newspaper and stared in sheer horror. The neighbor adjacent to us paused with his dog, his eyes locked on the old man writhing on the cold gravel. Bradley, despite the heavy sedatives clouding his brain, recognized the primal sound of his father suffering. He stumbled out the front door, pushing past the 2 massive thugs. "Dad," he slurred, dropping to his knees beside me, his hands hovering uselessly over my chest. "Dad, what is happening?" I grabbed his forearm with a vice-like grip, digging my fingers into his jacket. "My heart." "Bradley," I wheezed out, ensuring my voice carried across the lawn to the watching neighbors. "It is my heart. The pain is crushing me. You have to drive me to the clinic right now. Please do not let me die out here on the driveway." Bradley panicked, his drugged mind struggling to process the life or death emergency unfolding right in front of him. He looked up at his wife, his eyes wide and completely terrified. "Victoria, we have to take him. Get the car keys." Victoria stood frozen on the porch, her face a mask of absolute suppressed fury. She looked at the 2 transport men who were waiting impatiently with their clipboard. She looked at the neighbors who were now taking hesitant steps toward our property, their phones ready to dial for an ambulance if she did not act quickly. Trapped by the judging eyes of her wealthy community, Victoria gritted her teeth in pure defeat. She snatched the clipboard away, telling the men to come back later. I had finally won my desperate battle for crucial time. The Nevada trip was officially delayed, and Jonathan finally had time. The Nevada trip was officially delayed, and Jonathan finally had time. Bradley drove like a maniac through the morning traffic, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard, his knuckles were entirely white. I sat in the passenger seat, maintaining my performance with shallow, ragged breaths and occasional groans of manufactured agony. Victoria sat in the back, her silence radiating a furious, toxic energy that practically fogged the windows. The moment we pulled into the emergency drop-off zone at the clinic, a team of nurses rushed out with a wheelchair. They loaded me in firing rapid medical questions at Bradley, whose heavily sedated mind could barely process the basic intake forms. He stood at the admission desk, blinking sluggishly, completely unable to recall my basic medical history. Victoria had to aggressively push him aside to answer the nurses, securing her role as the deeply concerned daughter-in-law for anyone who happened to be watching. They wheeled me back into a private examination room and immediately instructed my family to wait out in the hallway. The heavy wooden door clicked shut finally, giving me the absolute privacy I so desperately needed. An older, weary-looking cardiologist stepped into the room and began attaching the cold, sticky sensors of an electrocardiogram machine to my bare chest. He asked me to describe the pain, and I gave him a textbook recitation of mild angina symptoms, ensuring it sounded serious enough to warrant a full workup, but not severe enough to trigger an immediate surgical intervention. Just as he turned his back to calibrate the monitor, the secure burner phone tucked deep inside my coat pocket vibrated sharply. It was a rhythmic, continuous buzzing that signaled an emergency breakthrough. I waited for the cardiologist to finish his preliminary reading. He frowned at the completely normal rhythmic spikes printing out on the thin paper strip. He told me he was going to step out to consult with the attending physician and order a comprehensive blood panel to check for cardiac enzymes. I nodded weakly, thanking him for his thoroughness. The second the heavy door closed behind him, I ripped the blood pressure cuff off my finger and pulled the phone from my coat. I pressed the device to my ear. "Jonathan," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly low. "Tell me what you found." Judge Jonathan replied, his voice uncharacteristically tense. "You need to pull your granddaughter out of that house right this second. The behavioral modification facility in Nevada does not actually exist. It is a completely fabricated front." I tapped into their corporate registry files. The medical license numbers provided on their official website are entirely stolen from a closed pediatric clinic in Ohio. The Nevada address listed on their charter is nothing but an empty dirt lot registered to an anonymous shell corporation based out of Delaware. If they put Lily in that transport van today, she is not going to a hospital. She is going to disappear completely. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. My breathing actually hitched, no longer a performance for the doctors, but a genuine physical reaction to the sheer terrifying scale of this deception. "Who owns the Shell Corporation?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the phone. "We are still tracing the exact digital paperwork," Jonathan continued rapidly. "But I just finished the deep dive on Victoria Harrison. You asked me to look for hidden debts. Judge, she is drowning in them. Victoria is a compulsive high-stakes gambler. She has an offshore account tied to illegal sports betting syndicates, and she currently owes them upward of $400,000 in immediate cash. These are not the kind of people who send polite collection letters. They are threatening her life, and she is desperate for a massive, instantaneous payout." The pieces of this sinister puzzle suddenly locked together with devastating clarity. This was never a frantic, misguided attempt to handle a rebellious teenager. This was not a panicked overreaction to finding fake drugs in a bedroom. This was a highly methodical, cold-blooded, and carefully calculated strike against my family's accumulated wealth. Victoria had married my son systematically, alienated him from his support network, and began drugging him into a state of total, unquestioning compliance. She needed to remove Lily from the equation to gain absolute unrestricted access to the family finances. By framing Lily as a violent addict and having her legally banished to a ghost facility under Bradley's heavily sedated signature, Victoria was clearing the final obstacle blocking her path to the money. She needed hundreds of thousands immediately to save her own skin from the betting syndicates, and she was willing to destroy 2 generations of my bloodline to get it. If I allowed those men to take Lily today, I would never see her alive again. Victoria was treating my family like a disposable bank account, completely devoid of empathy or human decency. She had underestimated the absolute lengths a grandfather would go to for his blood. "I am sending you the complete financial dossier right now," Jonathan added. "You need to take this straight to the federal authorities. Local police will not be able to unravel this fast enough." "I am not going to the police yet," I told him, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "If I involve uniforms right now, she will panic, destroy the localized evidence, and spin another web of lies. I need undeniable proof of the pharmaceutical abuse happening inside that house. Keep your team on standby. I am going back in." I hung up the phone and shoved it back into my pocket. The time for playing the weak, dying grandfather had officially expired. I looked down at my chest, grabbed the tangled mess of colored wires, and forcefully ripped the adhesive sensors directly off my skin. The heart monitor beside the bed instantly flatlined, emitting a loud, continuous, and piercing alarm that echoed through the small examination room. The heavy door swung open, and the cardiologist rushed inside, flanked by two extremely panicked nurses who immediately reached for the emergency medical cart. "What are you doing?" the doctor shouted, reaching his hands out to push me back onto the examination table. "You are experiencing an active cardiac event. You need to remain completely still." I slid off the edge of the elevated bed and planted my boots firmly on the solid tile floor. "I am checking myself out," I said, buttoning my shirt with swift, deliberate precision while maintaining absolute eye contact. "I want the discharge paperwork printed immediately against medical advice." The doctor looked at me as if I had completely lost my mind, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "I am not authorizing your release, sir. Your family is right outside in the waiting room. They are incredibly worried about your condition." "Let them worry," I replied coldly, grabbing my heavy winter coat and sliding it over my shoulders. I pushed past the bewildered medical staff, my posture entirely rigid and commanding. The war for my family had just officially begun, and I was going to burn Victoria's entire world straight to the ground. I marched out of the examination room with a singular burning focus, leaving the bewildered medical staff stammering behind me. My heavy winter coat felt like armor as I navigated the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the clinic. When I reached the main waiting area, Victoria and Bradley both stood up from the uncomfortable plastic chairs. Bradley swayed slightly on his feet, his heavily sedated eyes struggling to focus on my face. Victoria immediately put her hands on her hips, her expression twisting into a mask of impatient annoyance masked as deep concern. She demanded to know what the doctors had found and why I was walking around instead of resting in a hospital bed. I looked directly at her, keeping my face entirely devoid of emotion. I told her that the cardiologist had detected a minor irregularity in my lower left ventricle. I explained with practiced medical terminology I had picked up over the years that the hospital administration required me to be transferred to the cardiac observation wing for a mandatory 48-hour monitoring period. I told them I was not allowed to leave the premises under any circumstances until the final enzyme panels cleared. Victoria let out a very quiet, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. She thought I was permanently sidelined, trapped in a hospital bed for the next 2 days, completely unable to interfere with her sinister plans for Lily. She placed a gentle hand on Bradley's shoulder and told me that they should probably stay at the clinic to keep me company. I immediately shook my head and held up a firm hand to stop her. I told Bradley he looked completely exhausted and needed to go home to manage the situation with Lily. I pulled out my smartphone and swiftly ordered a premium rideshare service, entering their home address as the destination. I insisted that they take the car rest and let the medical professionals handle my care. Bradley nodded sluggishly, mumbling a weak agreement as he leaned heavily against his wife. Victoria hesitated for a fraction of a second, her calculating eyes searching my face for any sign of deception. Finding nothing but the weary mask of a sick old man, she finally nodded, gave me a stiff hug, and guided my son out the sliding glass doors toward the waiting black sedan. I stood in the clinic lobby and watched the vehicle pull away into the relentless morning rain. The moment their taillights faded into the gray mist, I turned on my heel and walked out a side exit. I did not go to the cardiac wing. Instead, I walked 3 blocks through the freezing downpour to a long-term parking garage where I kept an old, unassuming gray sedan for emergencies. It was a vehicle neither Bradley nor Victoria had ever seen. I climbed into the freezing driver's seat, started the engine, and turned the heater on high. My chest ached slightly, not from a heart attack, but from the sheer adrenaline coursing through my veins. I pulled out of the concrete structure and began the tense, methodical drive back toward my son's affluent suburban neighborhood. The rain lashed against the windshield in heavy rhythmic waves, providing the perfect cover for what I was about to do. I parked the gray sedan 3 blocks away from Bradley's estate, tucking it neatly between a row of dense evergreen hedges and a large delivery truck. I turned off the engine and sat in the suffocating silence of the cabin for a few minutes, reviewing the layout of the property in my mind. When I had originally purchased that sprawling house for Bradley, I had meticulously inspected every single door window and security blind spot. I knew that the cameras focused heavily on the front porch and the main driveway, but the narrow side path leading to the utility entrance was a complete dead zone. I stepped out of the vehicle and pulled the collar of my heavy coat up around my neck. I kept my head down, walking with a brisk, steady pace along the wet sidewalk. I avoided the glowing street lamps, sticking to the deep shadows cast by the towering oak trees lining the wealthy neighborhood. My boots made soft, slushing sounds against the wet pavement, a quiet rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. When I reached the edge of my son's property, I slipped behind the thick stone retaining wall and moved silently down the narrow utility corridor. The rain masked any noise I made as I approached the heavy side door. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out a small worn brass key. I had kept this spare key on my ring ever since the day the real estate agent handed over the property files. Victoria had changed the main security codes twice since she moved in, but she had never bothered to replace the physical deadbolts on the secondary doors. I slid the cold brass key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying heavy click. I pushed the door open just wide enough to slip my broad shoulders through and stepped into the dark, silent laundry room. The air inside the house was warm and smelled faintly of expensive vanilla candles, a sickening contrast to the vile corruption hiding within these walls. I closed the door silently behind me, engaging the lock with absolute care. I stood in the dark for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, listening to the ambient sounds of the house. The rhythmic hum of the refrigerator, the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. And then I heard it. A sharp, furious voice echoing from the back patio. It was Victoria. She had left the sliding glass doors slightly ajar, completely unaware that a ghost had just entered her pristine sanctuary. I crept silently through the kitchen, pressing my back against the cool marble island, and peeked around the corner. Victoria was pacing frantically across the covered stone patio, a lit cigarette trembling between her fingers. She was screaming into her cell phone, all traces of the sweet, caring stepmother completely obliterated. She demanded more time, swearing aggressively to the person on the other end of the line that she would have their money transferred the absolute second the trust fund cleared. She was completely unhinged, trapped like a rat in a corner by the gambling syndicates she owed. I stood in the shadows of my son's kitchen, watching the true monster reveal herself in the gray morning light. My infiltration was perfectly successful. The house was mine to command, and she had no idea the executioner was already standing inside her walls. Every single lie she had ever told was about to unravel entirely. I took a deep, slow, completely silent breath, feeling the cold dampness of my winter coat against my shoulders. I knew that I had only a very narrow window of opportunity before she returned inside. My pulse pounded relentlessly in my ears, but my hands remained entirely perfectly still. I slowly turned away from the sliding glass door, absolutely ready to execute the next devastating phase of my carefully planned retribution today. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the kitchen, watching Victoria pace like a caged animal on the back patio. The heavy rain masked the sound of her furious voice as she screamed into her cellular phone. I knew my window of opportunity was incredibly narrow. The moment she finished appeasing whatever dangerous gambling syndicate she owed money to, she would step back inside. I reached deep into the inner pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out a small, matte black case. Inside the case rested 3 micro cameras, each no larger than a standard shirt button, equipped with wide-angle lenses and secure cellular transmitters. I moved silently across the expensive hardwood floor, my wet boots leaving only the faintest trace of moisture. I approached the massive industrial-grade espresso machine resting on the marble countertop. Every morning without fail, Victoria prepared a highly specific herbal tea or dark espresso for my son right at this exact station. It was the absolute perfect vantage point. I peeled the adhesive backing off the first tiny camera and pressed it firmly into the dark, recessed crevice just beneath the digital display panel of the machine. The lens was completely invisible. I pressed a tiny button on the side of the device, and a microscopic green light flashed once, confirming it was actively transmitting. With the kitchen under full surveillance, I quietly slipped into the adjacent living room. The grand space was immaculately decorated, filled with expensive modern art and plush velvet furniture that I had ultimately paid for. I moved toward the massive stone fireplace. Above the mantel hung a large abstract painting that Victoria had proudly purchased last year. I reached up my 70-year-old shoulder joints, protesting the sudden stretch, and attached the second micro camera directly to the dark wooden frame of the canvas. This specific angle provided a completely unobstructed panoramic view of the main staircase, the front entryway, and the entire seating area. 2 cameras down, 1 to go. I slowly checked my wristwatch. Barely 3 minutes had passed, but the adrenaline surging through my veins made it feel like an eternity. The muffled sounds of the heavy rain beating against the large windows provided a steady, rhythmic drumbeat to my mission. I turned my attention toward the hallway leading to Bradley's private study. This was the most critical location. If Victoria was forcing my sedated son to sign any legal documents or emergency guardianship forms, it would happen right there on his mahogany desk. I walked swiftly down the carpeted corridor and pushed the oak door open. The study was dark, smelling faintly of old paper and leather. I moved directly to the large bookshelf behind my son's desk. The shelves were lined with thick legal volumes and architectural reference books that Bradley rarely opened anymore. I selected a dark green encyclopedia on the second shelf, pulled it forward just a fraction of an inch, and secured the final micro camera to the dark spine. I adjusted the tiny lens, ensuring it had a crystal clear view of the desk surface and the 2 leather guest chairs sitting opposite it. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of victory. The surveillance net was flawlessly deployed, and then the heavy sliding glass door in the kitchen slammed shut. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze in the middle of the study, my breathing entirely suspended. I could hear the sharp, distinct clicking of Victoria's heels hitting the hardwood floor of the kitchen. She was muttering curses under her breath, her voice radiating toxic anger. I calculated the distance to the front door. It was impossible. I would have to cross the main hallway in plain sight. If she saw me standing inside her home, my entire operation would collapse instantly. The clicking of her heels moved out of the kitchen and into the main hallway. She was walking directly toward the study. I had nowhere to hide. The room offered no closets, and crawling under the desk would only delay my inevitable discovery by a few seconds. Panic gripped my throat. I looked around the dim room, my eyes frantically searching for an escape route. Then I saw it. Tucked in the far corner of the study was a narrow, secondary door that led down to the unfinished portion of the basement. The footsteps grew loud. She was right outside in the corridor. I lunged forward, grabbed the doorknob of the basement door, and twisted it sharply. It gave way with a squeak. I threw my body into the dark stairwell, pulling the door tightly shut behind me, just as the main door to the study swung open. I stood frozen on the top step, swallowed by the darkness of the basement stairwell. Through the thin wooden door pressing against my back, I could hear Victoria let out a frustrated sigh. I heard the thud of her heels crossing the study. She walked right past the door, hiding me moving toward the mahogany desk. I held my breath, praying that the ambient noise of the rain outside would mask the pounding of my own heart. I could hear the distinct sound of paper shuffling and drawers opening and closing rapidly. She was looking for something specific. A ledger, a bank statement, perhaps the very emergency guardianship forms she had forced my son to sign earlier that morning. I did not dare to move a single muscle until I heard her heels click away from the desk and march back out into the hallway. The moment the study door clicked shut, I slowly exhaled a breath. I did not waste another second. I carefully navigated the steep, narrow stairs down into the basement. I moved toward the utility window set high up on the concrete foundation wall. It was meant for ventilation barely large enough for a grown man to squeeze through. I climbed onto an old storage crate, reached up, and unlatched the metal latch. The window swung open, letting a blast of freezing rain and cold air into the dark basement. I grabbed the concrete ledge, pulling my aching frame upward with every single ounce of physical strength I had left in my body. My shoulders scraped painfully against the rough concrete frame, my heavy winter coat snagging on the sharp metal hinges. I pushed my body through the narrow gap, tumbling out headfirst into the muddy flower bed right alongside the house. I landed hard on my side, the freezing cold mud soaking completely through my trousers and jacket. I scrambled to my feet, keeping my head down, and sprinted through the shadows of the tall evergreen hedges. I did not stop running until I reached the absolute safety of my gray sedan, parked exactly 3 blocks away. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy door shut, and locked it instantly. I sat in the dark, shivering from the bitter cold and adrenaline. I pulled my tablet from the passenger seat and activated the highly secure application. 3 bright live video feeds brilliantly illuminated the dark cabin of my car. I sat perfectly still in the freezing driver's seat of my gray sedan, the heavy rain relentlessly pounding against the roof and the fogged glass. The engine was completely turned off to avoid drawing any unwanted attention from passing neighborhood security patrols. The biting cold seeped through the thick fabric of my winter coat, settling deep into my aging bones, but I barely registered the physical discomfort. My absolute focus was anchored entirely to the glowing screen of the tablet resting on my lap. The customized surveillance application was running flawlessly, dividing the high-resolution display into 3 distinct, crystal-clear video feeds. The living room, the kitchen, and the study were all brilliantly illuminated in high-definition color, transforming me from a helpless, grieving grandfather into a silent, omniscient observer inside my son's house. I tapped the screen with a trembling finger, enlarging the living room feed to fill the upper half of the display. The panoramic angle from the hidden camera tucked inside the abstract painting frame was absolutely perfect. I could see the grand staircase sweeping down into the main entryway. For several long, agonizing minutes, the house appeared entirely still, looking exactly like the peaceful, affluent suburban sanctuary it was always supposed to be. But the illusion of domestic tranquility was violently shattered when Victoria suddenly marched down the wooden stairs. She was dragging a large, heavy black suitcase behind her, the hard plastic wheels loudly thumping against each wooden step with a harsh, aggressive rhythm. She reached the bottom landing and practically threw the heavy luggage across the polished floor. Lily followed closely behind her stepmother, moving with the slow, terrified hesitation of a beaten animal. My granddaughter was clutching a small canvas tote bag tightly against her chest, her shoulders hunched forward defensively. Victoria spun around and snatched the tote bag directly out of Lily's fragile grip with completely unnecessary force. Through the high-definition audio feed transmitted directly to my earpiece, I could hear Victoria snapping vicious, degrading commands. She unzipped the main compartment of the black suitcase and began aggressively shoving Lily's folded sweaters and denim jeans inside, treating the personal belongings like contaminated garbage. She did not fold anything properly. She simply crushed the garments down with her fists, barking at Lily to stop crying and start acting like a responsible adult for once in her pathetic life. The sheer, unadulterated venom in Victoria's voice made my stomach physically churn. She was deliberately breaking my granddaughter down, stripping away every single ounce of her remaining dignity right before the extraction team arrived to take her away permanently. Lily just stood there weeping silently, her bitten fingernails digging into the sleeves of her jacket, completely unaware that the burner phone I had hidden inside was her only remaining lifeline. Victoria slammed the suitcase shut violently, yanking the zipper closed before shoving it toward the front door. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at Lily's tear-stained face, ordering the terrified 15-year-old girl to sit on the bottom step and not move a single muscle until she was explicitly told to do so. Lily obediently sank onto the lowest wooden stair, burying her face in her hands, completely defeated. Victoria let out a loud, frustrated breath, smoothing down the front of her expensive silk apron with a sharp, calculated motion. She turned her back on the weeping child and marched straight down the hallway, disappearing from the living room camera feed. I immediately tapped the lower left corner of my tablet screen, expanding the video feed, transmitting from the micro camera perfectly concealed inside the kitchen espresso machine. The bright, sterile overhead lights of the kitchen illuminated the white marble countertops with clinical clarity. Victoria stepped into the frame, her face completely transforming the absolute second she was out of Lily's direct line of sight. The angry, volatile stepmother instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, mechanical efficiency. She moved methodically toward the large stainless steel refrigerator, opening the heavy door and pulling out a container of leftover chicken soup. She placed a pristine porcelain bowl onto the kitchen island, perfectly positioned, just a few feet away from my hidden camera lens. I watched her spoon the thick broth into the bowl with calm, deliberate movements. She placed the bowl into the microwave, punching in the time with her sharp acrylic nails. While the soup heated, she pulled a wooden cutting board from the lower cabinet and began slicing a loaf of fresh sourdough bread. She was preparing a warm, comforting afternoon lunch for her heavily sedated husband. It looked like the ultimate picture of devoted domestic bliss, a loving wife taking meticulous care of her exhausted partner. But I knew better. I knew there was absolutely nothing loving about the woman standing in that kitchen. The microwave beeped 3 times, a sharp electronic chime that pierced the quiet tension in the house. Victoria opened the door and carefully pulled the steaming bowl of soup out, setting it gently onto the marble island right in front of the espresso machine. I leaned forward in my freezing car seat, my eyes locked intensely on the high-resolution screen. My thumb hovered over the red circular icon located on the right side of the surveillance application. I pressed the record button firmly. A small red timer appeared in the corner of my display, capturing every single frame of the live video directly to my encrypted remote server. Victoria glanced over her shoulder quickly, visually confirming that the hallway leading to the kitchen remained entirely empty. She reached her hand deep into the front pocket of her silk apron. When she pulled her hand out, her slender fingers were tightly gripping a small, dark, amber glass vial. The tiny bottle was completely unlabeled, lacking any standard pharmaceutical branding or medical warning stickers. She unscrewed the black plastic dropper cap with practiced, chilling ease. She held the glass dropper directly over the steaming bowl of chicken soup. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 heavy, thick drops of a clear, viscous liquid splashed silently into the warm broth. She did not stop there. She reached into her apron again and pulled out 2 large, chalky white pills. She placed them onto the wooden cutting board and used the flat side of a heavy kitchen knife to violently crush them into a fine, powdery dust. She scraped the crushed narcotic powder directly into the soup using a silver spoon to stir the tainted liquid until every single trace of the drugs had completely dissolved into the broth. She was not just managing his anxiety. She was methodically, chemically lobotomizing my son to maintain absolute, unquestioning control over his mind and his massive financial estate. The sheer, calculated evil of her actions finally crystallized in front of my watching eyes. I was documenting the methodical, intentional poisoning of my own son, and I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that if I did not act very quickly and very decisively tonight, this incredibly ruthless and evil woman was going to murder him in cold blood just to legally inherit all the massive family wealth without leaving a single trace. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, the blue light casting a glow across my hands. I watched Victoria pull the silver spoon from the steaming bowl of chicken soup and tap it against the porcelain rim. She wiped the counter, ensuring not a single speck of the crushed white powder or a rogue drop of the clear liquid remained on the surface. Her movements were terrifyingly practiced. This was a refined daily ritual. She placed the vial back into the pocket of her silk apron, completely concealing the weapon she was using to destroy my family. Victoria picked up the bowl with both hands. She walked out of the kitchen frame, and I tapped the tablet screen to expand the living room camera feed. The lens hidden inside the frame captured her walking gracefully into the grand seating area. Bradley was sitting on the edge of the sofa, his head resting heavily in his hands. He looked completely shattered, a hollow shell of the vibrant man I had proudly raised. He did not even look up when she approached him. Victoria knelt on the rug right in front of him, playing the role of the devoted, nurturing wife. Through the hidden microphone, I could hear her voice dripping with sweetness. She told him that he needed to keep his strength up for Lily's sake, that the stress of the morning had drained him, and that a warm meal would help him think more clearly. Bradley slowly lifted his head, his eyes struggling to focus on the bowl she was offering him. He nodded weakly, mumbling a word of thanks that barely registered over the audio feed. He took the bowl with trembling hands and lifted the spoon to his mouth. Every single time he swallowed the tainted broth, a wave of helplessness washed over me. I was sitting barely 3 blocks away in a cold car, watching my only son actively consume poison. I could not smash through the front door to knock the bowl out of his hands without jeopardizing the entire rescue mission for Lily. I had to sit there and witness his chemical execution in real time. As he consumed the soup, the devastating reality of Victoria's specific pharmaceutical choice began to click together in my mind with horrifying clarity. Jonathan had mentioned her connections to dangerous gambling syndicates groups, known for operating in the darkest corners of the criminal underworld. The clear liquid she had dropped into his food was certainly scopolamine. I had presided over enough international narcotic smuggling cases during my 40 years on the bench to recognize the devastating effects of the drug known on the streets as the devil's breath. It is a highly toxic, mind-altering alkaloid that completely neutralizes the central nervous system's ability to form free will. It chemically lobotomizes victims, leaving them in a profound state of absolute unquestioning suggestibility. A person dosed with heavy scopolamine will gladly hand over their bank passwords, sign complex legal documents, or agree to send their own child to a remote desert facility without experiencing a single shred of internal resistance. And the 2 crushed white pills she had added to the mixture were undoubtedly heavy medical-grade sedatives meant to mask the manic side effects of the primary drug. She was systematically dissolving my son's cognitive functions, turning him into a highly compliant puppet that she could pilot toward her greedy objectives. This was why Bradley had stared at the wall of the police station with empty, lifeless eyes, while his daughter wept in the corner. This was why his signature on the emergency guardianship forms had been nothing more than a jagged, frantic scribble. He was not suffering from crippling stress or parental heartbreak. He was being aggressively drugged into a state of permanent waking paralysis. I watched the video feed intently as Bradley finished the last spoonful of the soup. He placed the empty bowl onto the glass coffee table and leaned back against the plush velvet cushions. Almost immediately, the heavy dosage of the sedatives began to take a visible toll on his physical body. His broad shoulders slumped completely forward. His chin dropped toward his chest, and his eyes fluttered rapidly before glazing over with a thick, unnatural vacancy. Victoria reached out and gently stroked his hair, a maternal gesture that made my blood run absolutely cold. She softly asked him if he was feeling better, and he simply mumbled a slurred, incoherent response, his mind fully surrendering to the toxic chemicals now aggressively circulating through his bloodstream. Victoria smiled, a triumphant curve of her lips that radiated pure, unadulterated malice. She stood up from the floor, picked up the empty porcelain bowl, and walked away, leaving her husband slumped on the sofa like a discarded broken toy. The sheer psychological horror of the situation settled heavily onto my shoulders, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. Victoria was not just trying to quietly steal money from his bank accounts. She was actively preparing the ultimate, fatal stage of her plan. If Lily was successfully removed from the house and legally banished to that ghost facility in Nevada, Bradley would become the sole remaining beneficiary of the massive family trust fund. But a chemically dependent, sedated man would eventually draw suspicion from corporate partners, banking officials, and family members. Victoria could not keep him in a permanent state of drug-induced compliance forever without someone noticing the drastic decline in his health. She had to know that, which meant her endgame was not to manage a sedated husband for the rest of her life. Her endgame was to eliminate him entirely the exact moment the money was legally transferred into his possession. She was going to overdose him, stage a tragic heart attack, and walk away as the grieving, wealthy widow. I gripped the steering wheel of my hidden sedan, my knuckles aching from the intense pressure. I had spent my entire career passing judgment on murderers, thieves, and violent criminals, but I had never encountered a predator as intimately dangerous as the woman standing inside my son's house. She had weaponized the sacred bonds of marriage and family trust, turning my son's home into a deadly pharmaceutical prison. The rage burning inside my chest was no longer a frantic fire. It had transformed into a cold, focused, and absolutely lethal determination. I was going to tear her carefully constructed, sinister world apart, piece by piece, and I was going to ensure she spent the rest of her miserable life rotting behind cold steel bars. I reached over and turned off the tablet screen, plunging the cabin of my car back into complete darkness. I had seen more than enough. I had the undeniable high-definition video evidence of her poisoning him securely uploaded to my encrypted server. But evidence alone was no longer enough to satisfy the debt she now owed my family. I needed to move to the next phase of the operation before the afternoon extraction team arrived to take Lily away. I pulled my burner phone from my pocket and stared at the dark screen, calculating my exact next move. Before I could dial Jonathan, a sudden flicker of movement on the tablet display caught my attention. I lowered the phone and leaned closer to the monitor, locking onto the third video feed from the mahogany study. The hidden camera within the dark green encyclopedia provided a flawless view of my son's desk. The heavy oak door swung inward, and Victoria stepped into the room. She pushed the door firmly shut, engaging the lock with a click. She was completely alone, confident she was isolated. Her posture shifted instantly. The faux maternal concern she had just displayed in the living room melted away like cheap wax. She ran a hand through her hair, letting out a sigh of arrogant triumph. She walked around the desk and sank into Bradley's high-backed leather chair. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her cell phone, and quickly dialed a number from memory. I maximized the audio feed for the study, pressing the earpiece deeper to ensure I did not miss a single syllable. The ringing tone echoed clearly, followed by a man answering with a low, intimate chuckle. Victoria leaned back in my son's chair and kicked her expensive heels up onto the polished surface of the desk. "I told you not to call me on this line while the extraction team is in transit," the man said, his voice dripping with arrogant familiarity. "Relax, darling," Victoria replied smoothly, a wicked smirk spreading across her face. "The brat is packed and sitting by the front door. We had a minor delay because the old judge showed up and staged a pathetic little health crisis on the driveway. He actually made Bradley take him to the local clinic." I clenched my jaw so tightly my teeth ached. She thought my heart attack was an inconvenience, but she had absolutely no idea her entire criminal empire was unraveling from the front seat of a gray sedan parked just 3 blocks away. The man on the phone sighed heavily. "Is the old man going to be a problem for us?" Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sent a wave of pure disgust rolling through my stomach. "Not at all," she boasted confidently. "He is trapped in the cardiac observation wing for the next 48 hours. By the time they release him, Lily will already be securely locked inside your facility, and Bradley will be in no condition to answer his father's phone calls. The man chuckled again, the sound vibrating through the hidden microphone. Good work, Victoria. My transport guys will be back at your house at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon to collect the girl. I have the isolation room prepped and ready for her arrival. The moment she crosses the state line into Nevada, my facility assumes absolute medical authority over her communications. She will not be allowed to make a single phone call. Victoria smiled, tracing her fingernail along the edge of Bradley's desk. Perfect. We just need to keep her entirely isolated until next Friday. The man paused for a second. Remind me again why next Friday is the magic deadline for this entire operation. Victoria rolled her eyes, her tone taking on an impatient, greedy edge. Because next Friday is her 16th birthday. That is the exact date the $15 million trust fund set up by her dead grandmother legally unlocks. Patricia was paranoid enough to structure the trust so that Lily gains partial access at 16. But there is a specific medical incapacity loophole written into the foundational charter. I leaned closer to the screen, my blood turning to ice. Patricia had indeed set up that trust fund before she died, designing it to protect Lily's future. Victoria had somehow gained access to our most guarded private financial records. If Lily is officially declared mentally unfit and committed to a secure behavioral facility by her legal guardian, Victoria, explained the entire $15 million automatically defaults back into Bradley's primary accounts for her ongoing medical care. The money bypasses the trust restrictions completely. The man let out a low whistle of greedy appreciation. $15 million in liquid cash. You are brilliant, Victoria. But what about your husband? What happens when Bradley wakes up and realizes his daughter is gone and his bank accounts are overflowing with millions of dollars? Victoria let out a cold, soulless laugh that chilled me to the core. Bradley is never going to wake up, she stated with terrifying certainty. The dosage I am giving him right now keeps him perfectly compliant, so he can sign the final bank transfer authorizations next week. But the absolute second that $15 million clears into our joint checking account, I am doubling his medication dose. I am going to flood his system with the scopolamine and the heavy sedatives. The man on the phone went completely silent for a moment. You are going to kill him. Victoria did not even hesitate. It will not look like a murder, she corrected him smoothly. The chemical combination I am using mimics the exact physiological symptoms of a massive cardiovascular failure. The coroner will look at the recent stress of his daughter being institutionalized, look at his father's documented heart issues from this morning, and rule it a tragic stress-induced heart attack. As his legal wife, I will inherit every single penny of his estate, including the trust fund money. We pay off the gambling debts, wire the rest offshore, and disappear to the islands just like we planned. I stared blankly at the glowing tablet screen, completely paralyzed for a moment by the pure, unadulterated evil I had just witnessed. This was never just about a cruel, manipulative stepmother abusing a vulnerable, helpless teenager. It was never just about hiding a dirty secret affair or stealing money to cover massive hidden gambling debts. This was a highly calculated, incredibly ruthless, multi-million-dollar assassination plot. She was going to murder my only son in cold blood, lock my granddaughter in a fake psychiatric prison, and walk away with the entire financial legacy my wife and I had spent our entire lives building. The scale of her betrayal was absolutely staggering, a monstrous violation of every moral boundary known to mankind. My aging hands suddenly stopped shaking. The frantic, desperate panic of a frightened grandfather completely evaporated, replaced by the cold, lethal clarity of a man going to war. I reached down and ended the recording, ensuring the video file was permanently locked into my secure remote server. I picked up my burner phone and stared at the glowing digital keypad. I did not simply dial Jonathan Mitchell. I did not just call the local police precinct down the street. Local detectives and county warrants would take far too long to successfully navigate this massive level of interstate wire fraud, kidnapping, and attempted murder. I needed absolute, overwhelming, and immediate devastation to descend upon that house before the afternoon transport arrived. I scrolled through my encrypted contact list and pressed call on a private, highly restricted number. I was finally cashing in a personal favor from the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation himself. Before I could even dial Jonathan to coordinate the next move, a sudden flicker of movement on the tablet display caught my attention. I lowered the phone and leaned closer to the monitor, locking my eyes onto the third video feed, transmitting live from the mahogany study. The hidden camera concealed within the green encyclopedia provided a flawless view of my son's heavy desk. The solid oak door swung inward, and Victoria stepped into the quiet room. She pushed the heavy door firmly shut behind her, engaging the brass lock with a sharp click. She was completely alone now, entirely confident she was isolated. Her physical posture shifted instantly. The faux maternal concern and the gentle wife persona melted away like cheap wax. She ran a hand through her hair, letting out a sigh of arrogant triumph. She walked around the desk and sank comfortably into Bradley's high-backed leather chair. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her cell phone, and dialed a number from memory without hesitation. I maximized the audio feed for the study, pressing the earpiece deeper to ensure I did not miss a single syllable. The ringing tone echoed clearly, followed by a man answering the line with a remarkably intimate chuckle. "I told you not to call me on this line while the extraction team is in transit," the man said, his voice dripping with an arrogant familiarity that made my stomach churn. "Relax, darling," Victoria replied smoothly, a wicked smirk spreading across her face. "The brat is completely packed and sitting obediently by the front door. We had a minor delay because the old judge showed up unannounced and staged a pathetic little health crisis on the driveway. He actually made Bradley take him to the local cardiology clinic." I clenched my jaw so tightly my teeth ached. She thought my heart attack was a mild inconvenience, completely unaware her criminal empire was unraveling from the front seat of a gray sedan 3 blocks away. The man on the phone sighed heavily. "Is the old man going to be a problem for us today?" Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sent a wave of pure disgust through my veins. "Not at all," she boasted. "He is securely trapped in the cardiac observation wing for the next 48 hours. By the time they release him, Lily will already be locked inside your facility, and Bradley will be in no condition to answer his father's frantic calls." The man chuckled again. "Good work, Victoria. My transport guys will be back at your house at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon to collect the girl. I have the isolation room prepped and ready. The absolute moment she crosses the state line into Nevada, my facility assumes complete medical authority over all her communications. She will not be allowed to make a single phone call." Victoria smiled, tracing her fingernail lightly along the polished edge of Bradley's desk. "Perfect. We just need to keep her entirely isolated until next Friday afternoon." The man paused for a brief second. "Remind me again why next Friday is the magic deadline for this entire operation." Victoria rolled her eyes, her tone taking on a greedy edge. "Because next Friday is her 16th birthday. That is the exact date the $15 million trust fund set up by her dead grandmother legally unlocks. Patricia was paranoid enough to structure the massive trust so that Lily gains partial financial access at 16. But there is a specific medical incapacity loophole written directly into the foundational charter." I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my blood turning completely to ice. Patricia had indeed set up that trust fund before she died, designing it specifically to protect Lily's future. Victoria had somehow gained access to our most guarded financial records. If Lily is officially declared mentally unfit and committed to a secure behavioral facility by her legal guardian, Victoria explained calmly, the entire $15 million automatically defaults back into Bradley's primary accounts to cover her ongoing medical care. The money bypasses the strict trust restrictions completely. The man let out a low whistle of greedy appreciation. $15 million in liquid cash. You are brilliant, Victoria. But what about your husband? What happens when Bradley wakes up next week and realizes his daughter is gone and his accounts are overflowing with millions of dollars? Victoria let out a cold, soulless laugh that chilled me to the absolute core. Bradley is never going to wake up, she stated with terrifying certainty. The dosage I am giving him right now keeps him compliant, so he can sign the final bank transfer authorizations next week. But the absolute second that 15 million clears into our joint checking account, I am doubling his daily medication dose. I am going to flood his system with the scopolamine and the heavy sedatives. The man on the phone went completely silent. You are going to kill him. Victoria did not even hesitate. It will not look like a murder, she corrected him smoothly. The chemical combination mimics the exact physiological symptoms of massive cardiovascular failure. The coroner will look at the stress of his daughter being institutionalized, look at his father's documented heart issues, and rule it a tragic heart attack. As his legal wife, I automatically inherit every single penny of his estate, including the trust fund money. We pay off the syndicate gambling debts, wire the rest offshore, and disappear to the islands just like we planned. I stared blankly at the glowing tablet screen, paralyzed for a long moment by the pure, unadulterated evil I had just witnessed. This was never just about a highly manipulative stepmother abusing a vulnerable teenager. It was never just about hiding a secret affair or stealing money to cover massive gambling debts. This was a highly calculated, incredibly ruthless, multi-million-dollar assassination plot. She was actively going to murder my only son in cold blood, lock my granddaughter in a fake psychiatric prison, and walk away with the entire financial legacy my wife and I had painstakingly built. The sheer scale of her betrayal was absolutely staggering, a monstrous violation of every moral boundary. My aging hands suddenly stopped shaking. The frantic panic of a frightened grandfather evaporated into the cold air, replaced by the lethal, unbreakable clarity of a man going to absolute war. I reached down and ended the recording feature, ensuring the high-definition video file was permanently locked into my secure remote server. I picked up my burner phone and stared intensely at the glowing digital keypad. I did not dial Jonathan Mitchell for this. I did not call the local police precinct down the street. Local detectives and county warrants would take far too long to successfully navigate this massive level of interstate wire fraud, kidnapping, and attempted murder. I needed absolute, overwhelming, and immediate devastation to descend upon that house before the afternoon transport arrived. I scrolled through my encrypted contact list and pressed call on a private, highly restricted number. I was finally cashing in a massive personal favor from the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation himself. I lowered the burner phone into my lap and gripped the steering wheel of my hidden sedan. The dashboard clock marked the time as 1:58 in the afternoon. The relentless rain had slowed to a freezing drizzle, leaving the street ominously quiet. Exactly 2 minutes later, the heavily tinted transport van turned the corner and rolled down the block. It pulled to a halt right in the center of Bradley's driveway. The heavy side doors slid open, and the two muscular thugs, wearing tactical gear, stepped out onto the wet gravel. I watched through my windshield as the front door of my son's estate swung wide open. Victoria stood triumphantly on the grand porch, her posture radiating absolute wicked victory. She gestured sharply toward the dark hallway, and the two massive men marched inside without a shred of hesitation. A few agonizing seconds later, they reappeared forcefully, dragging a weeping, struggling Lily out into the freezing afternoon air. My granddaughter was clutching her denim jacket, digging her heels into the hardwood floor, begging for her father to help her. But Bradley was nowhere to be seen, deeply unconscious under the chemical cocktail Victoria had lovingly prepared for lunch. The larger of the two men grabbed Lily by her upper arm, roughly yanking her down the concrete steps toward the waiting van. Victoria stood on the porch with her arms casually crossed over her chest, a smug smile plastered across her flawless face. She was watching her assassination plot perfectly fall into place. She thought she had won. She thought the old judge was completely out of the picture. I slammed my foot heavily onto the accelerator pedal. My steel-reinforced SUV roared to life, the tires screeching as they desperately gripped the wet pavement. I tore out from behind the dense evergreen hedges, entirely abandoning the safety of my hidden vantage point. I aimed the heavy grille of my vehicle directly at the front axle of the menacing transport van. I braced my body against the steering wheel and prepared for the violent impact. The sheer kinetic force of my heavy SUV smashing directly into the side of the stationary van crushed its engine block instantly. Shattered glass and twisted metal rained down across the wet gravel. The brutal impact violently shoved the heavy van sideways, pinning the passenger side door shut and trapping one of the fake paramedics against the brick retaining wall. The second thug, who was dragging my granddaughter, lost his footing and tumbled hard onto the wet grass, momentarily releasing his grip on Lily. I shoved my door open and stepped out into the freezing drizzle, my face set like thunder. Lily scrambled backward across the muddy lawn, her eyes wide with absolute shock as she recognized me. I pointed a commanding finger toward my vehicle and ordered her to get into the back seat and lock the heavy doors. She did not hesitate for a single second, scrambling up and sprinting toward the safety of my truck. Victoria stood completely frozen on the top step of the porch, staring at the smoking wreckage in her driveway. The smug, victorious smile was entirely wiped from her pale face, instantly replaced by a mask of frantic fury. "Are you completely insane?" she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the quiet neighborhood street. "You could have killed them. I am calling the police right now, Richard. You are going to prison for this." She reached into her expensive jacket, fumbling to pull out her cell phone. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I stood calmly in the middle of the driveway, the rain soaking my shoulders, and I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy winter coat. "I am afraid local law enforcement is not going to have the appropriate jurisdiction to handle the specific crimes committed here today, Victoria," I said, my voice projecting with the resonant authority of a presiding judge delivering a final, inescapable sentence. I pulled my high-definition tablet from my pocket and held it up so she could clearly see the screen. I did not wait for her to dial. I pressed my thumb firmly against the play button on the remote surveillance application, having previously routed the audio output through my vehicle's powerful external speakers. Victoria's own voice boomed across the entire driveway, echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding luxury homes. The recording from the mahogany study played with crystal-clear precision. "Relax, darling. The brat is packed and sitting by the front door. We had a minor delay because the old judge showed up." I watched the blood drain from Victoria's face as her own arrogant words filled the freezing air. The audio continued mercilessly, detailing the exact moment the $15 million trust fund would unlock, and the deliberate isolation of my granddaughter. The true, devastating impact arrived a few seconds later. The recording reached the sinister climax. The absolute second that 15 million clears into our joint checking account, I am doubling his daily medication dose. I am going to flood his system with the scopolamine and the heavy sedatives. The coroner will rule it a tragic stress-induced heart attack. As his legal wife, I automatically inherit every single penny. Victoria dropped her cell phone. The expensive device shattered against the concrete steps, but she did not even look down. Her knees buckled slightly, her hands trembling wildly as she stared at me in sheer, unadulterated terror. The two fake paramedics immediately raised their hands and slowly backed away from the wrecked van, desperately looking for an escape. But there was absolutely nowhere left for them to run. Before the thugs could take another step toward the street, the deafening wail of federal sirens shattered the neighborhood silence. 4 unmarked armored black Subarus tore around the corner, their tires sliding aggressively on the wet pavement. They breached the perimeter of the estate from every possible angle, completely sealing off the street and blocking the driveway exits. The doors flew open simultaneously, and a dozen heavily armed FBI agents swarmed the front lawn, their tactical weapons drawn and raised. The lead agent barked a sharp, booming command for everyone to get down on the ground immediately. The two fake paramedics instantly dropped to their knees, interlacing their fingers behind their heads in total surrender. I stood my ground, silently stepping slightly to the side, to give the federal agents a clear, unobstructed path to the front porch. Victoria tried to take a frantic step backward toward the heavy oak door, her mouth opening and closing, as she desperately searched for another plausible lie to spin. But there were no more lies left to tell. An agent charged up the concrete steps, grabbed her roughly by the shoulder, and spun her around. I watched with deep, cold satisfaction as the woman who had tried to murder my son and destroy my family was forcefully slammed face first against the hood of a federal vehicle. The cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around her wrists, securing her in a tight, inescapable grip. Her sinister empire of manipulation, poison, and greed was completely, permanently dismantled. The metallic click of steel handcuffs locking tightly around Victoria's wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my 70 years of life. I stood silently on the wet gravel, the freezing rain continuing to fall, and watched as the arrogant woman who had tried to systematically destroy my family was stripped of her freedom. The Federal Bureau of Investigation agents moved with absolute terrifying efficiency. They patted her down, confiscated her shattered phone from the concrete steps, and aggressively shoved her into the back of a heavily armored transport vehicle. She was no longer an untouchable suburban housewife, orchestrating a brilliant multi-million-dollar assassination plot from the comfort of a luxurious living room. She was now just a broken criminal facing the absolute wrath of the federal justice system. The two fake paramedics who had tried to drag my granddaughter away were already secured in a separate vehicle. The sheer scale of the federal response transformed the affluent neighborhood into an active crime scene. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the wet brick facades of the surrounding houses, serving as a stark warning to anyone who believed they could hide evil intentions behind expensive front doors. The moment the immediate threat was neutralized, a small, trembling figure pushed past the perimeter of armed agents. Lily sprinted across the muddy grass, her denim jacket soaked completely through from the relentless rain. She threw herself into my arms with a crushing force that nearly knocked me off balance. I wrapped my heavy winter coat securely around her shaking shoulders, burying my face into her wet hair. She was sobbing uncontrollably, but these were no longer tears of suffocating terror. They were the deep, exhausting tears of profound relief. I held her as tightly as my aging arms would allow, whispering quiet, reassuring promises into her ear. I told her that she was finally safe, that the nightmare was permanently over, and that absolutely no one was ever going to take her away from me again. A team of emergency medical technicians rushed onto the property, their heavy boots splashing through the puddles. Two paramedics approached us gently, wrapping a thick thermal blanket around Lily's shoulders and guiding her toward a waiting ambulance to check her vital signs. I watched them care for her before turning my undivided attention toward the front door of the estate. The war was not over yet. I still had a son trapped inside. I followed the second team of emergency medical technicians as they charged up the front steps and breached the main hallway. The inside of the house was completely silent, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos unfolding out on the street. We moved rapidly through the grand entryway and burst into the main living room. Bradley was still slumped exactly where I had last seen him on the hidden camera feeds. He was completely unresponsive on the plush velvet sofa, his chin resting heavily against his chest, his breathing dangerously shallow and uneven. The heavy mixture of the scopolamine and the powerful medical-grade sedatives was actively shutting down his central nervous system. The paramedics moved with incredible speed and professional precision. They laid him flat on the expensive rug, immediately checking his pulse and pupil reactivity. One of the medics shouted a series of rapid clinical observations, confirming profound chemical sedation and respiratory depression. They did not waste a single second. I watched with a tightly clenched jaw as they prepared a large syringe filled with a powerful counteracting agent designed specifically to flush the heavy narcotics from his bloodstream and stabilize his failing cardiovascular system. The medic injected the antidote directly into Bradley's upper arm. The next few minutes felt like an absolute eternity. I stood in the corner of the living room, praying silently that the chemical damage was not entirely irreversible. Slowly, agonizingly, the steady color began to return to my son's pale face. His chest rose and fell with a much deeper, more natural rhythm. He let out a low, groaning sigh, his eyelids fluttering as the heavy chemical fog began to gradually lift from his brain. He was not completely conscious yet, but the immediate life-threatening danger had passed. The paramedics loaded him onto a portable stretcher, preparing to transport him to a secure hospital for a comprehensive detoxification process. As the medical team wheeled Bradley out the front door, my burner phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. I answered it immediately. It was Jonathan Mitchell, and his voice radiated absolute triumphant satisfaction. "Judge, we have them," he announced proudly over the secure line. "The moment you triggered the federal response in Chicago, I coordinated directly with the local field office out in Nevada. A heavily armed tactical unit just breached the gates of the fake behavioral modification facility. They secured the entire perimeter and arrested the fraudulent director right in his main office. They caught him actively trying to shred the forged medical intake documents and the illegal wire transfer protocols. He is currently in federal custody, and the authorities are officially dismantling the entire Shell Corporation as we speak." I let out a long, heavy breath, feeling an immense, crushing weight finally lift from my exhausted shoulders. "Excellent work, Jonathan," I replied quietly. "Make absolutely sure the prosecution team receives every single piece of digital evidence from my encrypted server. I want the financial tracking data, the microcamera video files, and the audio recording of her explicit murder confession handed directly to the lead federal prosecutor today." Nothing slips through. The ensuing legal slaughter was absolutely unprecedented in its swiftness and sheer brutality. Victoria had arrogantly believed she was the smartest person in the room, but she had left a massive, undeniable trail of digital and financial evidence that the federal prosecutors completely weaponized against her. She was officially charged with a staggering list of severe felonies: interstate wire fraud conspiracy to commit kidnapping, aggressive pharmaceutical tampering, and the premeditated attempted murder of her legal husband. The overwhelming weight of the video evidence showing her deliberately poisoning Bradley's food, combined with the audio recording of her detailing the exact timeline for his assassination, left her expensive defense attorneys absolutely paralyzed. There would be no lenient plea deals. There would be no reduced sentences. Victoria was facing a mandatory minimum of 30 years behind the cold, unforgiving concrete walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary. The financial empire my late wife and I had spent decades carefully building was finally safe. The massive $15 million trust fund remained entirely secure, permanently protected from Victoria's greedy, blood-stained hands. I stood alone in the center of the quiet living room, listening to the fading wail of the police sirens echoing in the distance. The sinister poison had been completely extracted from the vulnerable veins of my family. The brutal war was finally over, and I had won the battle for their lives. I took one last look around the beautifully decorated silent space before turning my back on the nightmare forever. I walked out the front door, stepping back into the freezing rain, ready to bring my granddaughter safely home. 3 months passed since that chaotic afternoon in the pouring rain. The freezing winter slowly gave way to the gentle, thawing warmth of an early Chicago spring. The profound healing process for my family did not happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate journey requiring immense patience, but we were finally walking on a solid foundation built entirely on truth. I navigated my large sport utility vehicle down a quiet, tree-lined driveway located just outside the city limits. This was not a fabricated ghost facility managed by greedy criminals. It was a highly respected, legitimate neurological rehabilitation center specializing in severe chemical dependency and trauma recovery. I parked the vehicle and walked inside the main building, accompanied by my 15-year-old granddaughter. Lily walked beside me with a renewed sense of quiet confidence. Her shoulders were no longer hunched forward in perpetual fear. We entered a private, sunlit visitation room overlooking a peaceful outdoor courtyard. Bradley was already sitting at the round wooden table waiting for us. The physical transformation in my son was absolutely staggering. The thick, heavy chemical fog that had previously clouded his mind was completely gone. His eyes were clear, sharp, and intensely present. The brutal detoxification process from the heavy sedatives and the mind-altering narcotics had stripped away his physical strength for a short while, but he had finally regained his true self. He stood up slowly as we entered the room, his hands trembling slightly, not from pharmaceutical withdrawal, but from overwhelming, crushing remorse. He looked at Lily, and the tears immediately began to stream down his face. He fell to his knees right in front of her, completely ignoring the stubborn pride he used to carry. "I am so incredibly sorry, Lily," he wept, his voice breaking with genuine, profound heartbreak. "I failed you in every single way a father possibly could. I let a monster into our home, and I let her convince me that my own beautiful daughter was the problem. I should have protected you. I should have fought for you. I was so incredibly blind, and I will spend the rest of my entire life trying to make up for the terrible pain I caused you." Lily stood perfectly still for a moment, her own eyes filling with quiet tears. She did not pull away from him. Instead, she reached out and gently rested her small hands on his shaking shoulders. She forgave him, not with an instant absolution of all his failures, but with the pure, unconditional grace that only a child can offer a broken parent. She told him that she loved him and that she knew the dangerous drugs had stolen his mind away from her. I watched my son wrap his arms tightly around his daughter, burying his face in her coat, sobbing with the heavy, agonizing relief of a man who had narrowly escaped, completely destroying his own bloodline. Bradley then looked up at me from the floor. He thanked me for not giving up on him, for crashing through the elaborate lies, and for being the father he desperately needed when he was entirely incapable of saving himself. I placed a firm, reassuring hand on his shoulder, telling him that the road to full redemption was long, but he was finally walking in the exact right direction. Victoria had been formally sentenced just a few weeks prior. She stood in the federal courtroom stripped of her designer clothes and her arrogant smirk, and was handed a mandatory 30-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The man who ran the fraudulent clinic in Nevada received a similar fate. The devastating gambling syndicate that Victoria owed money to was simultaneously raided by the federal authorities, their illegal offshore accounts frozen completely. Justice had swept through their sinister lives like an unstoppable hurricane, ripping away every single trace of their stolen power. The true, lasting peace, however, materialized inside the safe walls of my own home. Following a swift and decisive legal battle, the family court judge had completely terminated Victoria's residual claims and awarded me full, permanent legal custody of my granddaughter. The massive $15 million trust fund remained entirely secure, permanently shielded from any future predatory threats. The depressing silence that had once haunted my large, empty colonial house was finally broken for good. I stood leaning casually against the doorframe of my warm, sunlit kitchen. The bright morning light poured through the large bay windows, casting a beautiful golden glow across the polished marble countertops. The house smelled incredibly sweet, filled with the rich, comforting aroma of melting chocolate chips and warm vanilla extract. Lily was standing at the kitchen island, wearing an oversized cooking apron that used to belong to her grandmother. She was laughing brightly, a clear, melodic sound that echoed perfectly through the high ceilings. She was busy rolling cookie dough into small, perfect spheres, completely absorbed in the simple, joyful task. I focused my gaze closely on her moving hands. The red, raw, irritated skin surrounding her nail beds was completely healed. Her fingernails, which had previously been bitten down to the absolute quick due to crippling anxiety, had finally grown back. They were healthy, strong, and painted a cheerful shade of light pink. The physical evidence of her internal terror had vanished entirely, replaced by the vibrant, undeniable signs of a teenager who finally felt completely safe in her own environment. She looked up from the metal baking tray, caught me watching her, and flashed a brilliant, carefree smile that mirrored my late wife beautifully. I smiled back, a deep, resonant warmth settling permanently into my chest. I realized in that quiet, perfect moment that family is not simply about sharing blood or passing down accumulated wealth. True family is an active, relentless duty. It requires you to stand as an unbreakable shield when the hungry wolves inevitably come scratching at your door. I had spent 40 years of my life delivering justice in a crowded courtroom, but the greatest, most important verdict I ever executed was the one that saved my granddaughter from the dark abyss. We had survived the ultimate betrayal, and we had emerged stronger, bound together, shown by a fierce love that absolutely refused to be conquered by greed. Evil rarely announces its arrival with a loud warning. It often creeps into your home wearing a warm smile and a perfectly plausible lie. This story teaches us that true love requires absolute, unwavering vigilance. When your gut instinct tells you something is deeply wrong with the people you cherish, never ignore it for the sake of temporary peace. Money and greed can easily twist even the most sacred bonds, but absolutely no amount of deception can ever outsmart a parent's fierce protective instinct. Always pay close attention to the silent cries for help. Trust your intuition, gather undeniable proof, and never hesitate to become the ruthless shield your family desperately needs. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button right now. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in my shoes to protect your own family? Do not forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next thrilling life story.